Hey, what's up, everybody? Today, a huge day for the Green Bay Packers as the official roster has now been unveiled. Now, granted, there's going to be changes here, right? Like, this isn't the 53-man roster all year long. This isn't probably even the 53-man roster heading into week one. We know of one change that's already going to be occurring. But nonetheless, this is their first official 53-man roster for this season. And I will admit, there were some surprises. The youth movement is definitely afoot in Green Bay, as Ken Ingle said on Twitter, because the average age of the Green Bay Packers roster is 25 years old and 177 days. Just a bunch of babies running out there for the baby pack. The oldest Packer now happens to be David Bakhtiari. So the youth movement is afoot, certainly, and that's reflected in a number of the roster changes or moves that the Green Bay Packers made today. The first one, notably, of course, occurred yesterday, but moving on from Pat O'Donnell and moving to Dan Whalen as punter. Certainly an age reduction for the team there. But there were several other instances in amongst the 53 that did subtract from the Packers' total age. And I think that that's one of the big storylines because some of these decisions did depart from what the Green Bay Packers historically have looked for at certain positions. One of the big news, one of the big surprises of the day, to some at least, was Emmanuel Wilson making the 53-man roster. The UDFA from Fort Valley State, who seemingly came out of nowhere to crack the 53. Yes, he led the NFL in rushing yards over the course of the preseason. Yes, he has worked his tail off. I've talked about how he seems to catch better than anyone expected. His vision is certainly better than anyone expected. But yet all along the Packers were playing coy and saying, well, when it comes to running back three, we need special teams. We need pass pro. And then they would talk about how Emmanuel Wilson hasn't gotten any of those opportunities in games. And yet here we are with Wilson being on the 53 instead of a guy like Patrick Taylor, who reliably has accomplished those two tasks historically for the Packers. So before I dive into the roster itself, I do want to cover just a couple things that I know pretty widespread out there on the internet. There have been several questions about. How does the IR work? How does practice squad work, etc.? So I'm going to spend just a quick minute doing that. First of all, when it comes to injured reserve, okay, if the Packers were to place a player on injured reserve, like today, it means that they are out for the season. That was previous for Tyler Davis last week. In the case of Tarvarius Moore, it applies. So they're out for the year. Now, Tarvarius Moore is a very interesting, questionable case that I'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so understand that if you see a player on this roster declared as IR, they're out for the year now. If they wanted to hold a player on injured reserve because of all the rules now about a player being able to come back after so much time on IR, they must be on this initial 53-man roster, which leads us to the first quirk in this roster, and that would be they released Matt Orzik, who everyone assumed was going to be the long snapper. Like right out of the gate this morning at about 7 a.m. Central Time, everyone who put forth the 53-man roster prediction just had it completely and utterly shot down because of the first move that the Packers made. So all hopes of a perfect 53 went right out the door because they released Matt Orzik. But along with releasing Matt Orzik, it also was leaked that they're just going to sign him back tomorrow. This is one of those weird get around the rules things for the NFL because they cut Orzik today and now they're going to place someone on IR. In my opinion, it more than likely is going to be Luke Tenuta given his leg injury situation. But by having him on the initial 53 today, they can bring Tenuta back later in the year. Whereas had they put him on the IR now, then he's out for the year. It's just a weird rule quirk that the NFL hasn't updated, which never has made sense to me. So Matt Orzik will be the long snapper for this team. He's going to get signed again tomorrow, but he's not on the official 53 today. The other thing is in terms of the practice squad. Basically everyone who's cut today from all teams across the league, most wind up having to go through the waiver system. Now, if they're a vested veteran because they have so much NFL experience, that's not the case, such as Pat O'Donnell yesterday. Been in the league for a long time. He was released. He can just go sign anywhere now. But for the vast majority of the releases today, they have to go through waivers, or technically, I suppose they were waived today. And teams have the opportunity tonight and tomorrow morning to put in claims on players that have been waived from other teams. And that takes until about 11 a.m. tomorrow morning, when the NFL will then release who claimed, who gets what from all of the releases or waves across the NFL. The Chicago Bears, not the Sheboygan Bears. The Chicago Bears have first dibs in that order. The Packers have 15th. And it's not like fantasy football where it's like once the Bears claim a guy, they go to the end of the line. No, the Bears have first dibs on every single player that was waived across the entire NFL today. So then once 11 a.m. tomorrow passes, then you'll start seeing headlines about the Green Bay Packers going out and signing this guy to their practice squad, this guy to their practice squad. We already know from some of the news and notes today that the Packers, in amongst releasing some of these guys, have also said, hey, you're unemployed today, but if you don't get claimed, we'd like to get you back here on practice squad tomorrow. This is the case for Austin Allen, the tight end. Supposedly, the Packers told him, hey, you're being released, but we want you back. So you'll start seeing announcements like that tomorrow after 11 a.m. So that's kind of the quirks that we're seeing here. In terms of my personal guesses, if you've been following along on the channel, I got like 48 out of 53, 49 out of 53, depending on. I'm not totally thrilled with it, but you know what? This year, I will take it because this was a questionable year for sure. If you do have any questions, comments, make sure you just put them down below. I'm going to try, as I talk about the roster here, to acknowledge every single comment that I can. So feel free just to post it. First one we got is from Peter. Hello from Bordeaux, France. I love your show. Go Pack Go. Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate it. I mean, that's awesome. We're internationally acclaimed. But really, sincerely, thanks, Peter. Thanks for being here today. So looking at this roster, top to bottom, quarterback came in basically exactly as expected. You got Sean Clifford and you got Jordan Love, right? We knew that was probably going to be the case. And then more than likely, Alex Magoo, I would think, is going to be asked to be on the practice squad. I have a very hard time believing the Packers want to have at least one practice squad quarterback. Probably will just be Magoo for all intents and purposes. At the running back position, this was probably going just down the roster, the first real surprise. Like I mentioned earlier, the Packers went with Emmanuel Wilson as opposed to Patrick Taylor. They did also release Nate McCrary. I didn't find that particularly surprising, but then waived with injury designations were Lou Nichols and Tyler Goodson. Now, you want to talk about real rule technicalities here. Let's go over this whole waived injury settlement thing and understand there's a little bit more nuance than what I'm going to explain right here. But the basic gist is when a player releases a team with an injury settlement, the player and the team come to some kind of negotiated agreement saying realistically, you would have been out for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, what have you. And then they have a price or a value placed upon X duration of time. See, and then the player is a free agent that can re-sign with the Packers, but the Packers basically have a 3-week window there, or a 3-week penalty before they could bring him back. So hypothetically, let's say in the case of Tyler Goodson, they waived him, right? They waived him injured. So they're going to come down with a settlement. Let's say it's a 3-week settlement. Okay. It would be 6 weeks before the Packers can then sign him back in any capacity. So that's what we see here with the running back position. Lou Nichols, Tyler Goodson, both waived with injury designations. Outright cut Patrick Taylor, Nate McCrary, and that leaves UDFA Emmanuel Wilson cracking the 53. I didn't think they would do it. I'm happy that they did. I mean, I thought Patrick Taylor was just going to be used on every single game in special teams, but the Packers didn't emphasize special teams as much as most people expected. And here we have Emmanuel Wilson on the 53. Really, really exciting. And frankly, at least in my opinion, really unexpected. I'm just surprised that they went there. Looking at the wide receiver position, that did fall pretty much exactly how I expected. Grant Dubose did not make the roster. They opted just to keep 6 wide receivers. Of course, those 6 being Watson, Reed, Wicks, Heath, Toure, and Dobbs. Released was Bonds, Miller, Watts, Melton, Cody Crest, and Grant Dubose. A few of those will absolutely find themselves back on the practice squad, assuming there's interest between both parties. Some of the more notable names for practice squad, I would think, would be Grant Dubose, Jadakiss Bonds I've seen floated with the practice squad a lot, Bo Melton, if he's willing to come back for another stint on the practice squad, assuming health in his case, or even Cody Crest, who did close out the training camp session preseason in a very strong manner for the Packers. So let's dive in. We do have a question here, and then I'll get back to the roster. Mawasa saying, who surprised you the most that made the 53? In terms of the biggest surprise that actually made it. Well, for one, I'm very surprised. I won't count this as the actual answer, but I'm very surprised that they retained Luke Tenuta on the 53 and then are probably going to put him on IR tomorrow so that they can bring him back. Now, Luke Tenuta, by all accounts, they really like him. They've done some slight experimentation with him at guard besides just his actual position of tackle, in which case that makes sense because guard depth on the Packers isn't exactly phenomenal with Sean Ryan and Royce Newman. But I am surprised that they took the step to include him on the 53 and opt to bring him back later in the year. Now, maybe it's just because they felt so comfortable with Orzik that this was some big orchestrated deal saying, hey, wink, wink, you're cut today. Come on back tomorrow. We got you. Like, maybe then it's fine, but still was surprised by that. In terms of just total picture, I would say my most surprising probably is what I was just talking about, Emmanuel Wilson. Not that he can't do it, not that he's not good enough, not that I don't believe he belongs. It's just I really thought that they were going to go with Patrick Taylor or just have two running backs and then try to put Wilson on the practice squad and elevate him when they need more actual run game support, less so teams and pass pro. But yet, the Packers did it, opting for youth and opportunity and potential over the traditional standbys that we've seen for so long. So hopping back on to the roster, looking at the tight end spot, a little bit of a surprise here, but not a ton. Josiah DeGuara, Tyler Kraft, and Luke Musgrave. Now, DeGuara being categorized in here with like tight end / fullback, which is where he belongs, but opting just to go with 3 at this hybrid position instead of also including Austin Allen or Henry Pearson. Now, both of them were outright released. I thought Pearson would have a chance at like an injury settlement type deal, but they went with the clean release instead. And I do believe that this is one position that the Packers are going to be actively shopping for tonight. This is a very long night for Brian Gutekunst's company as they go over the cuts from everywhere, trying to decide if they want to do a waiver claim or if it's worthwhile to do a waiver claim on a player, if someone's just going to pick them right before anyway. It's much like the draft that way. So I do think the Packers are going to be shopping for a tight end fullback. I know Albert O from Denver. He was a name that as soon as he got cut from Denver, people were very excited. And then he wound up not actually being cut and got traded to Philly instead. I know Mo Alley Cox has been mentioned. I didn't see him get released, but the Colts still might very well trade him for next to nothing, in which case maybe the Packers will want to absorb that cost. Or maybe just a tight end that we're not super familiar with, but chances are it's going to be a tight end in the mold of what the Tyler Davis role was, a strong special teamer and someone who can block. Someone who I saw that instantly caught my attention that got released today, if you'll recall, was Dominique Daphne, the former tight end from the Packers who signed this offseason with the Buccaneers and then didn't make the team. Perhaps a reunion there to fill the Tyler Davis role, since the Packers didn't feel as though Pearson or Allen was worthwhile enough to include right now. Got another question. I'm going to hit that. Lance asking only 4 corners. Stokes coming back week 5, but still, Nixon is mostly a special teams player. In regards to Nixon, he's going to be their starting slot corner this year. I mean, and with the way that the Packers play defense, with oftentimes their true base defense being nickel, Keyshawn Nixon at this point is basically a defensive starter. And he was up and down last year in that slot role, but I would argue mostly up. I don't have any of the numbers right offhand here, but he did turn in a very strong performance as the slot corner. I'm not totally shocked. I did predict it in my last video that they would go with just 4 corners, partly because the premium that they could keep at other positions was more valuable than hanging on to someone like Ennis Gaines, Ballantyne, Keandre Thomas, William Hooper, one of those guys that could have been cornerback 5 on the roster. So also taking a look at the early part schedule, I saw some people talking online about that right before I hopped in. They're not exactly facing the most like heavy hitters row of passers in the first month of the season. So maybe they're hoping to just get by. Maybe because they kept 5 safeties. Anthony Johnson Jr. has a world of collegiate corner experience. We know Darnell Savage can play the slot if necessary. So maybe they're just looking at the totality of the secondary and saying, hey, we have 9 in the secondary. Use them how you will. And both Joe Barry and Matt LaFleur have talked about the best 5 in the secondary being the most important thing as opposed to like safety versus corner designations. So something to bear in mind. I'm not completely shocked, but it's unconventional to say the least. One more question. This one from Steve is real. Yeah. Shocked they kept Royce Newman. Are you shocked? No. Don't get me wrong. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not that I love Royce Newman. It's not that I'm the largest Royce Newman supporter in the world. In fact, quite the contrary. My thing is they probably kept him because who else do they have at backup guard? Right? At tackle, they're pretty heavy. They've got Yash, they got Walker, they got Jones. But at guard, if they would have gotten rid of Royce Newman, the only backup guard that they have on the team is Sean Ryan, who is still very much in development. You could argue the same is very true about Royce Newman still being in development too, but still besides the point, they needed another body there. And even going farther on down the chart, like James Empey didn't really stand a chance to get on the roster, nor did Cole Schneider. Gene DeLance had taken some snaps at guard, but that was never really going to happen. He looked more of a body than anything throughout the majority of camp. So they needed depth at the guard position. Thus, you have Royce Newman still being employed by the Green Bay Packers. Now, maybe this is a spot that they look elsewhere. Maybe just like the tight end position, Gutekunst is shopping tonight. Maybe they're looking for another O-line. But Royce Newman's here to stay, at least for now. And I at least understand the rationale, even if I'm not the biggest Royce Newman fan. I hope that makes sense. Because ultimately, look, like if an injury happens on the interior, Zach Tom's going to kick in the interior, right? No doubt about it. And then you put Walker or Yash out at right tackle. But then if there's a second injury on the interior and you didn't keep Royce Newman, you're probably playing Sean Ryan. And I don't think the Packers are at a level of comfort yet with Sean Ryan that they were going to be okay with that. So for better or worse, here we got Royce Newman. And that kind of covers the offensive line, which I was going to talk about next anyway. So, hey, thanks, Steve, for the handy transition. Now, looking at the defensive side of the ball. Defensively, they did keep 6 defensive linemen. Those 6 would be Slayton, Wyatt, Wooden, Brooks, Clark, and Jonathan Ford. Now, I've gone on at length before. I fully appreciate that Jonathan Ford has improved this offseason. I get it. He's been talked about as one of the most improved players on the entire 90-man roster to this point. Again, I get it. But this is the 3rd straight year that the Packers have held 6 interior defensive linemen. 2 years ago, it was Jack Heflin, who you darn near never played. Last year is Jonathan Ford, who you never even bothered to activate for a single game as a 7th-round rookie. And now you're keeping 6 defensive linemen again. For what? Like, are you actually going to play Jonathan Ford this year? Maybe this is part of their scheme to improve the run defense, is by having an actual backup nose tackle in the form of Ford to spell Slayton. But then you're actually going to have to activate him as part of the 48 on game days, which we haven't seen the Packers do yet. So I get that Ford has improved, but why are you keeping 6 defensive linemen if you've never shown a tendency to play 6 defensive linemen? Unless something is going to be different in the scheme this year, which maybe it is. We don't know that yet. But I don't understand the logic completely here. Plus, a 7th-round pick from last year, Jonathan Ford, yes, he's put some good tape out during the preseason. I'm still believing that he would make the practice squad if they wanted to cut him and get him on the squad tomorrow. And if they don't get him on the practice squad tomorrow, is the difference between a Jonathan Ford and a Chris Slayton, who you released today, that much different? Yeah, probably not. So this is one that I just don't get. I mean, I understand Ford's improved, but from a roster building standpoint, I don't understand why the Packers insist on keeping 6 defensive linemen. In case you didn't catch on, the releases there were UDFA Jason Lewin, UDFA Antonio Moultrie, and Chris Slayton, who was on the preseason all of last year, darn near made the 53 last year, but just never had the same zing to him this year in the preseason, never had the same roster push this year that we saw last year. Now, one of the positions that I know everyone is very, very excited about today, outside linebacker edge. The Green Bay Packers did indeed keep 6 outside linebackers slash edge players on this roster. And of course, the obvious ones, right? Hollins, Gary, Enigbari, Brenton Cox, Lucas Van Ness, Preston Smith. Those are the 6. The notables here being a lot of people thought, well, if you're going to hang on to Cox, you probably got to get rid of Hollins, right? You're not going to keep 6 edge. But with some of the other special teamers being released, I don't find it that shocking. And Cox certainly earned his way onto the 53 by putting his head down, doing the work, showing the explosion that everyone knew he was capable of, while kind of going from program to program collegiately. So this does make a lot of sense. Hollins, they really like as a veteran presence and someone who's a little bit better on rundowns than someone like a Kingsley Enigbari, while LVN is very much learning the position, which we knew when they drafted him that it was going to be a learning curve, just like Rashawn Gary in year 1. What we can say is with Cox, with Hollins, with all 6 outside linebacker edge players for the Packers, this is absolutely one of the deepest and most talented edge rotations in the NFL, which is tremendously noteworthy. If you remember, even as short as 4 years ago, there were massive questions about the future of the position. So a completely overhauled position in the last almost half decade, but here we are. Now, inside linebacker. Inside linebacker is a super interesting one to me, but I do see I got a couple new questions. So let me just hop on here. Don Welsh saying, keeping Newman is okay till Tenuta is back, then waive him, please. That's totally possible, in my opinion. Now, it's made more possible if Tenuta actually pans out at guard. I know they've done some experimentation there with him, but I don't know with any level of certainty yet that Luke Tenuta can play guard, definitively. So if the rationale for keeping Royce Newman is we need bodies at guard, then Tenuta coming back doesn't necessarily solve that unless you know he can do it. And maybe we're getting there. That's just something we can't know yet at this point. Janelle, hello to you. Just got back from vacation. I hope it was a wonderful one. Hope it was a happy one. So looking at the next position, inside linebacker, the Packers actually opted to keep 5 here. And I admitted in my last video where I tried to predict the 53 that Tariq Carpenter was one of the most difficult decisions that I had to make. Reason being, defensively, the dude looked lost a lot. He just did. I mean, they played UDFA Jimmy Phillips over him for a stretch of camp at inside linebacker. And Carpenter was switching from safety to linebacker. And there were times where, dude just looked lost. So if you're going to keep Tariq Carpenter, it's because he's a special teams ace. I've been saying all along, all offseason, that he's one of the best open field tacklers you have. He proved that last year, time and again on special teams. And that's valuable for coverage. But is it valuable enough to give him a 53-man roster spot? That's slightly questionable in my opinion, but the Packers obviously felt different, feeling as though he's a worthwhile project to continue working on and just having him be a special teams ace in the meantime. So your inside linebacker position is Quay Walker, Tariq Carpenter, Eric Wilson, Isaiah McDuffie, and Devondre Campbell. Released was Jimmy Phillips Jr., who I absolutely feel should be brought back on the practice squad. I think he had a lot better of a camp than was ever really talked about. He was a very steady tackler, amongst other things. And then Marvin Pierre, one of the newest additions, who kind of looks like they just brought him in as a body for the last preseason game. So he also released as well. So I saw a lot of people thinking that maybe Eric Wilson would go if Tariq Carpenter was kept. Ultimately, though, with the Tyler Davis injury, with them needing some of the bulkier special teams guys, that's where Eric Wilson fits into play, not to mention his extensive starting experience going back to 2020 with the Minnesota Vikings, when Eric Wilson was a 100-plus tackler. I mean, Eric Wilson's got some legit prowess at inside linebacker. I know realistically he's number 4 on the roster, but I just kind of thought he would make it, and so here we are. Now, the cornerback position, I did talk about it a little bit. Yes, surprisingly, very unorthodox, the Green Bay Packers held only 4 cornerbacks on the roster: Jair, Keyshawn, Rasul, and Valentine. And I'm just realizing that the Packers having 4 corners that can very much go by one name, and you know exactly who they're talking about. But released was ultimately Elijah Hamilton, Shamar Jean-Charles, William Hooper, Corey Ballantyne, Tyrell Ford, and Keandre Thomas. Of course, Eric Stokes staying on the PUP. Now, keep in mind that the PUP now, unlike how it used to be 6 games. Now it's 4 games. So Eric Stokes being on the PUP means that he must miss a minimum of the first 4 games of the year. I have a feeling that it may be longer than that. I know he's running now. He did look good at camp doing running, but whenever he's been asked, whenever Matt LaFleur in a press conference has been asked, hey, Stokes coming back yet? We going to see Stokes at practice? It always has been an extremely flat, no, he's not ready yet. And given the severity of the injury to his leg, that's not exactly surprising. The guy had screws and a plate put in, and so much of his game is predicated on his 4.2 speed. That's a very, very debilitating injury for a player who needs that foot in full operation mode. So it may be a while before we see Eric Stokes back. Maybe. That's the best guess at this time, right? So rolling with 4 corners is curious, but like I said earlier, I have a feeling it has something to do with just keeping the best 5 at the secondary. So they're looking at this secondary group like it's a 9-person position. Lump them all together, and then find the best 5 to go out on the field, right, for your base nickel defense. That's the way the Packers seem to be approaching this, much like offensive line and the positional versatility that they value there so much. So surprising? Yes, in a way. Unorthodox? Certainly. And then you have the safety position. Yes. Dallin Levitt is still on the Green Bay Packers, much to the chagrin of many people that I know. But again, like others with the loss of Tyler Davis, I've said all along, Rich Bisaccia said Tyler Davis was his right hand. He feel like he lost his right hand when Tyler Davis went out with his ACL injury. I didn't think Bisaccia was willingly going to let the Packers also cut off his left hand in the form of Dallin Levitt. So Levitt is still here. Other safeties that they retained, Rudy Ford. Yeah. Darnell Savage, safety number 1. Absolutely. Jonathan Owens, and then Anthony Johnson Jr., the 7th-round rookie from Iowa State. Now, Jonathan Owens maybe makes it because of the Tarvarius Moore situation. I know that Owens has had a very up and down preseason, but in my opinion, he's been exactly as advertised. Struggling in coverage, sound tackler. That's what he was in Houston. That's what the Packers signed, and here he is. But Tarvarius Moore was a little bit more of a lottery ticket with his athleticism, his prior starting experience in San Francisco. And this is a very, very interesting case, in my opinion. Leading up to the announcement of the 53-man roster, there were several reports, I think from Bill Huber, I think even Tom Silverstein mentioned it from Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, that Tarvarius Moore was getting close to a return from his knee injury. He was just kind of working back up to speed. But then, all of a sudden, the Packers, when they announced the 53, put him on injured reserve, which knocks him out for the entirety of the year. They didn't pull a Luke Tenuta here or somebody else. Like, they didn't pull the thing of, like, give him a 53-man roster spot, cut someone else that we're going to re-sign tomorrow in order so that we can get Moore back later in the season. No, none of that. They just straight up put Tarvarius Moore on the injured reserve, knocking him out for the year, unequivocally. This also wasn't some, like, injury settlement like they did with Lou Nichols, where it's like, well, maybe we can bring him back in 6 weeks when we know that knee is good. No, done. Which is really surprising considering the reports were what they were over the last couple of days. So this is one thing that I'm very intrigued, if we ever do learn more, if the Packers ever say anything or if Moore ever says anything, very intrigued to see how this went down. Where did this miscommunication fall in? And then the outright releases at the safety position, according to the Packers, was Ennis Gaines. Yeah, after that Seattle game, was rough. And then Benny Sapp, who did have the game-closing interception against Seattle, but I think just didn't show enough to upend draft pick Anthony Johnson Jr. for one of the spots on the 53. Benny Sapp, I think unequivocally, they're going to try to get back on the practice squad. In fact, personally, if I were Brian Gutekunst, he's probably one of my first calls to try to get back on the practice squad. Now, in terms of who's going to play at the safety position, I really, really believe Darnell Savage will be on the field all the time. But then who else is going to play with Darnell Savage? Probably a mixture of guys. I don't think this is going to be as clean cut as we've seen in years past. You know, especially 2 years ago when it was Adrian Amos one side, Darnell Savage the other side. Fun. Or last year, it only kind of got complicated when injuries arose. This year, I think it's going to be much more Darnell Savage and then matchup dependent, package dependent. What wide receivers are we going against? Are they a run heavy team or are they a pass heavy team? Series by series, it may even be changing. That's what I think we're going to see out of the safety position this year. The Packers are trying, kind of like they've done at wide receiver in different years, everyone's got a job. They can't go on the field at the same time. So we're just going to try to guess what jobs we need when, and we'll just march them out then. We don't have the world's greatest safeties. But if we combine a whole bunch of guys who do a whole bunch of different things, then we can have one competent safety combined. I really think that that's their approach here. And Brian Gutekunst has shown a tendency to do that in the past. So my assumption is the safety position is very much going to be that this year. Then, in terms of the specialists, yes, of course, they held on to Anders Carlson, a kicker, and Daniel Whalen winning the punter job. I talked about it a little bit yesterday after the news came down. O'Donnell, I still believe, is better at the nuanced techniques of the position. Probably still is a little bit better of a punter than Whalen, even though Whalen has supposedly improved per Rich Bisaccia. But when it comes to corner kicking, things like that, O'Donnell had the leg up. But Dan Whalen was outperforming O'Donnell in just terms of like straight line punts, a good 6 to 7 yards per punt. And I think that the Packers are looking at this and going, all right, he's 8 years younger. He's $1.2 million cheaper. And he's competent enough as a holder to where he's not going to completely mess up the operation like we saw kind of with Corey Bojorquist a couple years ago. So let's give it to the young Irishman. And there you have it, Carlson and Whalen, the rookie duo at kicker and punter. Hopefully the Packers are feeling like we've got our specialist duo for the next 15 years. And then at long snapper, officially, there is no long snapper on the 53-man roster. As I mentioned at the very top of the video, Matt Orzik was released today, but he's going to be signed again tomorrow. That's already unofficially. Packers can't say that, but it's been leaked aplenty. We know Matt Orzik is coming back tomorrow and will be the team's long snapper officially. So there you have it. 53-man roster. Some surprises in amongst it. I do see a couple comments here that I'm going to hop on and address right away. Dan Lemon saying, just tuning in, they kept Royce Newman. Yeah, Dan, they did. For better or worse. I described it a little bit earlier. If you don't keep Royce Newman, then who's your backup guards? Who's your backup interior? Sean Ryan, who I don't think the Packers trust enough yet to fully be their only backup interior guy. Yeah, you could make the argument that Zach Tom would kick in, but it's just too thin. So you got Royce Newman, for better or worse. And maybe that's something that the Packers are going to look to upgrade through waivers tonight, free agency, maybe. But yeah, it's less than ideal. David saying Carpenter is not much of a surprise considering Taylor was released. Yeah, in that regard, David, I'm very much with you. You know, you can only cut so many of your special teams aces. And I have a feeling Patrick Taylor, if the Packers can get him on the practice squad for another year, I think we're going to see him elevated probably the max number of times they can do again. Because Taylor is very, very competent at pass pro, very, very competent in special teams, played on almost all of the different units of special teams, played with the ones darn near all preseason long. That's partly why it's a surprising move. But they're 100% confident they can get him back on the practice squad, I'm sure. So get him back on the squad and then still utilize him in teams as needed until you hit that call-up kind of barrier that's there. So yeah, I get it that way at least. Joseph S. saying the Ravens waived Travis Vokolek. Any other tight ends cuts you might consider? Yeah, you know, I actually saw a good back and forth about Vokolek earlier today between a Packers person and a Ravens person. And the conversation around Vokolek was he's a very natural receiver. Uses his body very, very well. I didn't go look it up myself, but apparently had a very athletic catch in a preseason game as of recent. Someone that has caught the eyes of a lot of Packer people. I have noticed that. But from everything I've ever read of Vokolek, he's much more receiver than he is blocker. When it comes to his game, blocking is his deficiency. And for the Packers, I mean, you could argue they've already got a receiver type whose deficiency is blocking in the form of Luke Musgrave, their number one tight end, right? And it's the same kind of argument I had with Albert O getting cut from the Broncos. And no, I did not look up the phonetics on how to say his name, so I apologize. I'm just going to call him Albert O. But when it was announced the Broncos were going to release him and then he wound up being traded to Philly, Packer fans were immediately saying, go get him. Well, Albert O was deemed unplayable in a number of run packages last year by the Denver coaching staff because the man can't run block. Wound up playing some slot receiver for the Broncos last year as opposed to being an inline tight end. Well, Packers have already got that kind of tight end covered, and I think Vokalek probably fits in the same mold. What they need is much more of a Tyler Davis type, someone who can play on teams, someone who can block really well. You know, as I mentioned closer to the top of the show, Dominique Daphne makes a lot of sense since he's been released by the Buccaneers and would very easily come right into the Green Bay offense quickly. Other tight end releases, I'm not going to lie, I didn't keep my eye so much on a lot of NFL cuts. It's more my project tomorrow. I was so focused in on the Packers today. But, you know, Dan Arnold was released by Philly not too long ago. And Arnold's, again, more of a receiving tight end, but has a lot more competency blocking than someone like an Albert O. I don't know about Vokalek specifically, but I would imagine so, given Arnold's history. Or a Mo Alley Cox from Indianapolis, because apparently Indy is considering trading him for next to nothing. So Mo Alley Cox, he's proven to be a competent blocker in the league. Plus, he played like 100 snaps last year for the Colts. Maybe someone like that, if the Packers are willing to pay the fee in both draft compensation, which I think would be a very late pick, plus Cox's contract, which I think is about $4 million. So that's kind of the big thoughts as it stands right now, but certainly the Packers are going to be shopping for a tight end, I would think. But it's going to be a blocker teams type, not a receiver type. Let's say that. Janelle saying Taylor is someone that will easily pass through waivers, knock on wood. Yeah, right, Janelle? The 1 year that we're assuming it's totally going to happen, yeah, watch it be the 1 year it doesn't. But, hey, look, that's kind of my thinking, right? If they're confident that they can get Patrick Taylor back, then do that, right? Keep Emmanuel Wilson, the guy who you're not sure that you can get back on the practice squad. The one thing that I will throw in here is both parties have to agree to come back to a practice squad, right? And we have seen it in the past where players say, hey, you've kept me on your squad for 2 years now. It's time I go join someone else's practice squad to see if I can truly crack the 53 there. You've made it clear what you think of me. Let me go elsewhere and make a new impression. So it is a little bit of a gamble to assume that you can just automatically get a guy back on a practice squad, especially with someone with NFL experience like Patrick Taylor. Because Patrick Taylor does have the right to go, hey, loved my time here. I know the system. I know I play well here, but I want to make a 53. And I see other teams with thinner running back depth charts than what you got. So I'm going to go try my luck there and see if they like my brand of football better. It's at least worth a consideration. David saying, thanks, John. I need to run. Absolutely, David. Hope you have a great day. Thanks for stopping by. And Joseph saying, any safeties or corners waived that we might consider? Yeah, again, I'm not going to lie. I didn't look much into the vast array of NFL cuts today. I did see Eric Rowe was released by Carolina. Rowe is a guy who I looked into him a little bit, has 8 years NFL experience, coming up on 30 years old, looks as though he may have lost a step, but was a very productive player for Philadelphia early in his career, had some good years in Miami as well. If they're looking for a truly experienced type, kind of like a Wish.com version of Adrian Amos, maybe they call up Eric Rowe. But the safety position is one that I feel like they might be rolling with what they got. They might actually be comfortable with their sum of all parts approach at the safety position. Corner, I'm willing to bet that they're just biding time until Stokes comes back. Now, we have no idea whether it's going to be 5 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks for Eric Stokes. We have no idea. We don't know where he is with his injury progress. But they love their four that they've got. There's no doubt about that. And at least until Stokes comes back, maybe they're able to retain on the practice squad a William Hooper, a Keandre Thomas. They'd love to get Ballantyne back, I'm sure. So maybe they're just banking on getting a couple of those guys back on the practice squad and then using game day elevations to give themselves a fifth corner for all intents and purposes and just surviving that way. That's kind of my feel. If they're going to go out and search the free agent ranks, I think they're looking predominantly at the tight end position, maybe looking to upgrade over Royce Newman. That may just be wishful thinking on my part, but maybe looking to upgrade over Royce Newman at the guard position. And that's kind of strikes me as it. I think the Packers want to roll with what they've got. We know that this is the transition year. This is the evaluation year. They're still going to try to win every freaking game. Don't get me wrong. But they're absolutely assessing youth this year. I said at the very, very top, the average age of this year's roster is 25 years, 177 days old. They're just youngins. And the Packers are going to use this as every opportunity to look at guys that maybe will play a part in their future and assess them accordingly. Steve saying, we know Alex Magoo will be back. If not, go get Billy Zappi. He's available. Yeah, I did see that. That was surprising. They also got rid of Cunningham, the quarterback as well. Like I saw that Mac Jones is now the only quarterback on New England's 53. Like I know initial 53s are quirky, but yeah, that's just downright concerning if I'm a New England fan. Quarterback's not one that you really want to screw with that much. So, yeah, I would assume they can get Magoo back on the practice squad again. It may be a situation of Magoo saying, you're going to be the third practice squad I've been on. You didn't want me on the 53. You barely played me in preseason. Now I'm going to go be on somebody else's practice squad. Maybe he's all in on coming back. We don't know. We can't know that right now. But I would agree, right? Like, if you're not going to get Magoo, go get Bailey Zappi. Like, that would be just fine. Not to mention, we would have so much fun with having him on the roster. So I would have no issue with that. Joseph saying, is Tenuta the only guy in the 53 likely to be put on IR tomorrow? P.S. Tim Boyle was released. Yes, Joseph, thank you. I didn't think of that. I did see that. Yeah, GM Aaron Rodgers didn't get to keep around his buddy at the quarterback position as Boyle was let go. Yeah, if they're looking for a depth quarterback, right? You know, Gutekunst still has Boyle's number. In terms of guys potentially, being injury designated on the 53, I just want to take a super quick scan. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Luke Tenuta is the only one on the 53 that has any type of long-standing injury to this point. And again, we don't know the exact severity of Tenuta's injury. Like when it first happened, Matt LaFleur's demeanor in the press conference said like it was going to be a while, like Tyler Davis a while. And then it wound up not being that, I guess. So we don't know the exact extent there. I think it's almost assuredly he's the one going on IR. But looking up and down the roster elsewhere, they really didn't keep too many of these injury-plagued players. Like a Tyler Goodson, who's had a shoulder injury for most of camp now. Or Lou Nichols, who I was very surprised they didn't try the IR arrangement with. So ultimately, I think Tenuta is going to be the only one. Other candidates, I would have said for sure could have been Tarvarius Moore, but we saw that what they did there. Other injuries, just off the top of my head, that are existing on the roster as it stands right now, would be Wicks with his hamstring. But by all accounts, from what we've heard, that one doesn't seem to be that terrible. And if it were that bad, I think they would have done the roster construction a little differently in terms of Wicks. Maybe likely hanging on to DuBose, like doing the 7 wide receiver thing until tomorrow and then throw Wicks. So you at least got 6 wide receivers for the first stretch of the season. All that leads me to believe that Wicks's injury isn't going to be that bad. So Peter saying, how about bringing back Jace Sternberger? He's been quite successful in the USFL. Yeah, again, though, he fits into that mold of more receiver than blocker. I don't know. Granted, I don't work for the Packers, and I'm certainly not an insider who's got the executives on speed dial, but I don't know as if when Sternberger was let go that it was this completely clean departure that said, hey, we're going to let you go. If you shape up, come on back. I've read enough rumors to believe that there's some truth to it, that at least in his time at Green Bay, there were some real coachability issues, that there were some immaturity issues. Keep in mind, he did have a little suspension in there as well. So maybe he's grown up, maybe he's past it, but generally when that happens in Green Bay and they let you go, they're done with you. I mean, look at Kylan Hill, look at Kingsley Keke, others throughout the years. So I know Jay Sternberger has been very successful in the USFL. I know he just got released by Buffalo. I just can't see a Green Bay reunion in the cards, given how they normally operate. Steven saying, go Pack, go, greeted gold dreams. Yes. The season is finally starting. It's time. Janelle saying, is Wicks healthy? Yeah, I just talked about that a little bit. We haven't been updated much, but I given how they only kept 6 wide receivers and didn't do the whole like keep 7 and then put Wicks on IR tomorrow, I just am inclined to believe it's not that bad. He's got to be back soon. I can't believe they go into week 1 with only 5 wide receivers on the roster. I think they would have constructed differently. Mitch saying the number one ability is availability, and hurt running backs are out there. Yeah. I mean, you're right? Tyler Goodson, Lou Nichols, both are incredibly unfortunate in different ways. Now, Tyler Goodson, a guy who you were hoping was going to continue on his progress. Early on in camp, he was even getting some snaps at the ones every so often. And it looked like he was truly making progress in pass pro, which, I mean, he's been a spark plug ever since he was a UDFA with the Packers. Like, we knew he had that ability. Where he was lacking was teams and pass pro. And it looked like he was taking steps in pass pro. And then this shoulder injury really set him back. So I am a little surprised that they decided to work out a settlement with Goodson and they're not just doing an outright release to get him back on the practice squad. Maybe it's a handshake deal. You know, we can't know that. Maybe the Packers are going to try to get him back. We can't know that. But you're right, especially at the running back position. The number one thing is availability. And, you know, both Nichols and Goodson didn't exactly show that this preseason. Mr. Simi is saying quirks, not quarks. Did I say it wrong? Did I say quirks? My bad. Sorry if I misspoke, but yes, they would be roster quirks as opposed to roster quarks. Sorry about that if I misspoke. So there you have it, everybody. That is the 53-man roster in its totality. Certainly some surprises, but nothing absolutely jaw-dropping shocking in my opinion either. If you're wondering just about my personal accountability, because hey, why not? That's fun. In my last video, I got 48 of the 53 correct. I missed on 5 individuals, one of them being the cute little Orzik-Tenuta swap that's going to occur tomorrow. I did miss on O'Donnell versus Whalen. I did miss on Patrick Taylor instead of Emmanuel Wilson. I thought Tavarius Moore was going to be on the 53, and yet here he is on IR. I thought Austin Allen was going to make the 53 as a placeholder to go get a different tight end, but yet, you know, here we are. They moved on from him as well. The players that I didn't expect to be on the roster were Tenuta, Carpenter, Ford, Wilson, and Whalen. So that's it. 40 out of 53, 49 out of 53, if you want to count that way. You know what? I'll take it, especially this year with some real roster quirks, if you will. One more comment here. Joseph sneaking in and saying, will Packers be tempted by any veteran wide receivers waived or stick with the youth movement? Which I agree with. Joseph, I think they're very much in on the youth movement. And that is one position that I can say with confidence. I just don't see them going out and getting a vet partly because of how the youth performed in camp and preseason. Like, yes, where there are some issues with youth and route running and Christian Watson's, deep route running ability. Sure. Like, there are some concerns that way, but they also exhibited all of the talent you want to see. And in this eval year, it just doesn't make a world of sense to take any snaps away from Watson, Dobbs, Reed, Heath, Wicks. Like, the list is long of guys that you just want to get on the field. Want to let them play, want to let them earn more chances. So to me, I just look at that position and I say, all right, that is one where they're not going to be tempted. They're just going to roll with what they got. And if they don't like what they got, then they move on from somebody and they bring Grant Dubose up to the 53. That's my feeling of what's going to occur there. Mitch saying Wilson was clocked at 22 miles an hour on the 80-yard run. That's special. Yeah, it really is. And frankly, speed that no one knew he had. I mean, this is a UDFA from Fort Valley State who put up remarkable numbers at Fort Valley State. But I mean, I'm not going to try to minimize that. A lot of those guys at smaller schools do that. But he didn't have the athletic profile testing wise. Like, he didn't go out and run like a 4.240. No, like this speed seemingly like came out of nowhere. Maybe he's just more of a gamer than a tester. We've seen guys like that in the past. Guys who exhibit more athletic prowess on the field than they do just in shorts. Maybe Emmanuel Wilson's one of those. But I mean, yeah, you're not kidding. 22 miles an hour on an 80-yard run is special. It's unique. And it's way more athleticism than I think anyone thought they had at the position. Like I was saying earlier at the very beginning, I said, I'm surprised they did it, but I'm definitely not upset that they did it. I thought they'd hang on to Patrick Taylor, but instead they hung on to Emmanuel Wilson. And count me amongst those that are happy, just surprised that it actually went down the way that it did. So, all right, thank you so much for joining me here on Lombardi Time Brews. I will be back later this week. I'm going to put out, maybe I'll go live again later this week just to hop on for Q&A just for some fun. But for sure, I'm going to put out videos Thursday and Friday, not live versions, actual constructed videos, going over updates to the roster, which we could certainly expect over the next 48 hours. Like I was saying earlier, we got IR moves, we got potentially waiver claims. Who knows? Stuff's coming, right? So I'm going to do an update on that. Also, probably going to go over what my concerns are looking over the 53. Where might still some deficiencies kind of creep onto the field of play over the course of the season this year. But also reasons for optimism with this 53 and why this Green Bay Packer team, you know, it's interesting. Throughout the preseason, you've seen the national narrative begin to change. Even Nick Wright on FS1 today said that the Packers are going to win the NFC North, which a month ago, no one was saying that. So, reasons for optimism. Nick Wright, I think, even said that the Green Bay Packers have the best vibes in the NFL right now. Intangibles off the charts. So, we're going to take a look at that as well as we finally begin to progress towards week 1 against the Chicago Bears. Thanks so much for joining me here today. Thanks so much for joining me all the time here on Lombardi Time Brews. I am endlessly thankful for you and carving out a little bit of time to hang out with me here at this little podcast we started just over a year ago. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. Thanks for participating in the comments. And as always, go Pack Go.